Yes, thank you. Mr. President, I rise today in the hours before President Biden's State of the Union address to discuss the reality of the past 3 years and the current circumstances of our nation. Together, my colleagues and I are here to speak on behalf of the American people who have been forgotten and left behind by President Biden. Those who know the true consequences of his administration's policies and who are really feeling the pain by the continued failures that have defined President Biden's time in the White House. Throughout my time in Congress, I've been guided by my eternal optimism. I feel like I can see beyond the gloom and push towards a brighter future. But, however, it is clear that this is not the perspective that is felt in communities across our country, as Americans realize that the state of our nation is not as strong as it should and could be. They continue to battle economic challenges that are making the American dream unaffordable. There's a continued assault on American energy, which started by canceling the Keystone XL pipeline, and now, just several weeks ago, the disastrous halting of the construction of the LNG export terminals. They see the unmitigated flow of illegal crossings at our southern border. They face the threat of rising crime, and they see the weakened state of America's standing on the global stage. President Biden remains the common denominator across each of these issues, and he continues to prove, and this is harsh, that he's just not up to the task of leading our country in a time when it's needed most. Perhaps the most consistent issue that has defined President Biden's tenure in the White House, and one that I hear constantly about back home, is the state of our economy and the persistence of high interest rates and inflation. Despite President Biden's claims, inflation has not cooled, and price hikes have worn down consumers over the past 3 years, making necessities like food and housing nearly unaffordable. The price of food at the grocery store, anybody who's listening to this that's been to the grocery store knows this better than anybody. The price of food at grocery stores and in our restaurants increased 2.6% just in the last year. But this is on top of the staggering 10% that food prices rose over the last year. So what used to be $100 worth of groceries in 2019 now costs $125. And just last week, it was revealed that food costs compared to income have hit a 33-year high, with American consumers spending over 11% of their disposable income on food. That means that the last time Americans paid this much for food, Terminator 2 was in the movies. Michael Jordan had just won his second MVP award, and HP had introduced the first color scanner. That's how long ago this was. Adding to this, U.S. home prices are at an all-time high. Housing costs have now become unaffordable for a record number of U.S. renters, and that is according to a recent Harvard study. Make no mistake, this is the economy that President Biden campaigned on, and it's the economy that his policies of reckless spending and high taxes were destined to create. The president has gone even as far as establishing a strike force, I don't know if we're going to hear about it tonight, a strike force on unfair and illegal pricing, which is nothing more than a cover so he can blame others for the effects of his policies. Another issue that will forever define President Biden's tenure is the historic crisis we've seen at the southern border, something we've all addressed on this floor repeatedly, and the devastating consequences that it has created. The most recent data shows that there were over 176,000 crossings along the southern border this past January. This marks the worst January on record and the 6th consecutive month where record was being set. That brings us to a total of 9 million illegal border crossings under President Biden's watch. Additionally, there were another 7,000-plus migrant encounters at the southern border on Monday, marking the 4th day in a row of over 7,000 encounters. While the White House remains committed to their message of no executive action can alleviate this crisis, they failed to mention the executive actions that they took literally hours after President Biden was sworn in. These executive orders on day one of Biden's administration dismantled the effective immigration policies of President Trump. The truth is, President Biden can take basic steps and end this chaos, but in some situations, and far too many of them, it may already be too late. The barbaric murder of Laken Riley is a national tragedy and was completely avoidable. The catch-and-release policies of President Biden and Secretary Mayorkas have allowed the catastrophe at our southern border to impact every community in our country and every state. Crime is all too familiar to this administration, especially right here in the president's backyard. While the administration is touting a drop in crime across other cities, violent crime right here in Washington, D.C. is up a staggering 39%. Multiple members of Congress have been recent victims of crime in this city, as have multiple members of my own staff. We must remember that President Biden owns this issue more than he would like to admit. Last May, he vetoed bipartisan legislation to overturn police reforms right here in Washington, D.C. Speaking of ownership, another issue that President Biden owns is the recent weakness that America has displayed on the international stage. We're living in a time where our nation faces the most dangerous global threats that we've seen in decades. Yet, President Biden has proven to be a president of weakness, while our adversaries are watching how the United States reacts to the challenges of our time. This display of weakness started with a disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, which signaled unreliability to our allies and weakness to those who want to do us harm. Then, President Biden did not establish a strong deterrent for Putin, suggesting that NATO and the U.S. might not take any action if Russia undertook a minor incursion. Next, the Biden administration engaged with Iran on fruitless nuclear talks, while the regime built up their nuclear capabilities and their militias attacked our own U.S. troops. Now there have been over 170 attacks on service members with minimal responses taken. This has also culminated most recently in the loss of 3 of our Army Reserve soldiers. During the State of the Union tonight, President Biden will draw a proverbial line in the sand and will ask the American people, which side are you on? I encourage my fellow Americans not to fall for this attempt to separate us or label us as enemies of one another, but rather we should join together in realizing that it doesn't have to be this way and that the American people truly deserve better. This leads to perhaps the biggest broken promise from the president. That was his pledge to unite our nation. We're fractured. There's no doubt about it. In this administration, anyone who disagrees with their policies is an extremist and a threat to our freedoms. I know the people of our country deserve better from the White House, and the state of our union has become weaker over the past 3 years. So I hope the president addresses these issues tonight in a meaningful way that doesn't finger point, doesn't blame, but that takes the issues and unites the country and finds solutions. With that, I yield the floor.